I was about to break a promise I'd kept for 3 years, and Antonio Ricci was going to make sure everyone watched. My fingers tightened around the tray until my knuckles went white. 6 crystal tumblers balanced on polished silver, amber liquid catching the light from the chandeliers overhead. From where I stood, Antonio looked like any other high roller. Expensive suit, heavy rings, a smile that owned the room. But I knew that smile. I'd seen it before, on men who thought power was something you could take with your fists. "Anything else I can get you tonight, Mr. Ricci?" I asked, voice steady, even though my pulse was hammering against my ribs. He didn't answer. Not at first. Behind him, poker chips clicked like teeth. Cards slid across felt tables. The casino floor hummed with the kind of money that made people disappear. And Antonio Ricci sat at the center of it all, fingers drumming on the table, eyes locked on me like I was the punchline to a joke only he understood. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city glittered like broken glass. 1,000 lives I'd never live. 1,000 people who didn't know what it felt like to count exits before counting tips. If this story gave you chills, show us some love with a like and share it with someone who needs a reminder that silence isn't weakness. It's power held back. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the dangerous beauty of restraint, and why the quietest people in the room are often the ones you should never underestimate. 10 minutes earlier, I'd been in the staff hallway, balancing orders and swallowing exhaustion, when I heard his voice carry across the dining floor. "That one," Antonio had said, pointing at me through the crowd. "The quiet one." His men laughed. The kind of laughter that made your stomach drop. I didn't react. I never reacted. That was the rule. Keep your head down. Serve the drinks. Collect your tips. Go home. I'd walked away from violence. From blood. From rooms where silence meant someone was already dead. But Antonio Ricci didn't know that. He thought I was just another waitress. Another nobody in a black vest and white shirt, here to smile and disappear when the night ended. So when he stood up from his table and called me over, I went. Because that's what waitresses do. When I reached him, he took his time looking me over. His crew circled closer. Phones came out. A few dealers glanced up from their tables, then looked away fast. They knew what was coming. They'd seen this show before. Antonio Ricci didn't just own this casino. He owned the fear in it. "You know who I am?" he asked, voice low and sharp, the kind of tone that expected only one answer. "Yes, sir." He smiled wider, gold tooth catching the light. "Good. Then you know better than to embarrass me." Before I could respond, he grabbed the drink from my tray and poured it. Not on the floor. Not on the table. On me. The whiskey soaked through my shirt, cold and burning all at once. Laughter erupted around us. Sharp. Cruel. The kind that followed you into nightmares. Antonio leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning like a king watching a jester stumble. "Now," he said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, "let's see if you've got the guts to do something about it." The room went still. Chips stopped clicking. Cards stopped sliding. Even the dealers froze mid-shuffle. Hands hovering over felt like they were waiting for permission to breathe. Antonio Ricci tilted his head, studying me like I was an insect under glass. His rings glinted as he tapped the table. Once. Twice. "Fight me," he said, each word deliberate, designed to humiliate. "Or crawl back to the kitchen and tell them you quit." Someone behind me whispered. A phone camera's red light blinked in my peripheral vision. This wasn't just about dominance. This was entertainment. Now, standing here with his eyes still on me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Muscle memory. It started in my fingers, then my wrists, Then my shoulders. My body remembered what my mind had tried to forget. The way weight shifts before impact. The angle of a wrist before it breaks. The exact pressure point that drops a man twice your size. I set the tray down slowly, carefully, like I was defusing a bomb. The silver caught the light as it touched the table. No shake. No tremble. Antonio grinned. There it is. Finally some. Then I met his eyes. And for the first time since this started, his smile faltered. Just for a second. Just long enough for doubt to flicker across his face like a shadow passing over glass. Because in that moment, he saw something that didn't belong on a waitress. Something cold. Something trained. Something that used to kill people for a living. Mr. Ricci, I said quietly, my voice calm in a way that made two of his men shift their weight. You don't want to do this. He laughed. But it didn't sound as sure anymore. It sounded like a man trying to convince himself he was still in control. And why's that, sweetheart? I didn't answer. I just adjusted my stance. Right foot back. Weight on the balls of my feet. Hands loose at my sides. It was subtle. Barely noticeable. But one of Antonio's older men, the one with the scar above his eyebrow, went rigid. His hand drifted toward his jacket. Not for a weapon. For his phone. Like he was about to call someone and tell them to stop what was happening. Antonio stepped closer, fists rising, confidence blooming back into his grin. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his knuckles. He thought he knew how this would end. He didn't. Because 3 years ago, I wasn't Lynn Moore, waitress at the Belmont Casino. 3 years ago, I was someone else entirely. Someone who only existed in classified files and whispered warnings. Someone Antonio Ricci should have been afraid to look at, let alone touch. But he didn't know. Not yet. Antonio swung. And in the half-second before his fist reached me, I remembered exactly who I used to be. Antonio Ricci learned early that the world belonged to men who took what they wanted. His father taught him that. Right before Antonio put a bullet in him. Power wasn't inherited. It was seized, claimed, defended with fists and fear until no one dared question it. And Antonio never lost. Not to rival families who thought territory was negotiable. Not to cops who thought badges made them brave. Not to men twice his size who learned too late that size didn't matter when you fought without rules. He'd built his empire on broken bones and burned bridges. On knowing exactly when to smile and when to bury someone so deep their own mothers stopped asking questions. Dominance wasn't cruelty. It was survival. 5 years ago, he'd walked into a backroom card game run by the Volkov brothers. They'd laughed when he sat down. Called him the tattooed kid. Said he didn't have the spine for real money. Antonio had smiled. Bet everything. Lost on purpose. Then he'd stood up, pulled a knife, and carved his answer into the eldest brother's cheek. I don't need spine, he'd said. I need you to remember me. By morning, the Volkovs were working for him. By the end of the month, they were dead. That's how Antonio Ricci operated. He didn't just win. He made sure you knew losing to him was the last mistake you'd ever make. So when the quiet waitress, Lynn, his manager had called her, showed up at his table with her tray and her carefully neutral expression, Antonio saw an opportunity. Not a threat. Entertainment. His crew was getting restless. Bored. Men like his needed reminders of who held the leash. Public displays kept them loyal. Kept them scared. And this girl. She was perfect. Small. Unremarkable. The kind of woman who blended into wallpaper and probably cried in bathroom stalls during her break. Easy prey. He'd poured the whiskey on her shirt and waited for the tears. The apology. The humiliation that would ripple through the room and reinforce what everyone already knew. Antonio Ricci owned this place. And everyone in it. But she didn't cry. She just stood there. Soaked. Silent. And something about that silence crawled under his skin. "Fight me," he'd said. "Or crawl back to the kitchen and tell them you quit." The room froze. Phones came out. His men circled the floor like wolves smelling blood. This was the moment. The breaking point. She'd either collapse or swing wildly. And either way, he'd win. He always won. Antonio stepped forward and grabbed her wrist. Not gently. He wanted her to feel the rings. The weight of his grip. The inevitability of what was coming. "Come on," he taunted, voice loud enough to carry. "Show everyone you're not just some scared little." He stopped. Because her wrist didn't pull away. It didn't shake. It didn't do anything. She just stood there, eyes locked on his, and for a fraction of a second Antonio felt something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. Her pulse was steady under his fingers. Her breathing calm. Like she'd been grabbed before. Like she knew exactly how this worked. And worse, like she wasn't afraid. "Mr. Ricci," she said quietly, too quietly for the crowd to hear. "You don't want to do this." Antonio's jaw tightened. His grip tightened. "Don't tell me what I want." But even as he said it, he noticed the room shifting. His men weren't laughing anymore. They were watching. Waiting. And the girl wasn't begging. She was thinking. Antonio shoved her back, just enough to create space for a real swing. "Last chance," he growled. "Defend yourself or—" That's when she moved. Not much. Just a subtle shift. Her right foot slid back half an inch. Her weight redistributed. Her shoulders dropped into alignment. It was barely noticeable. But across the floor, near the bar, Sal Dominic, Antonio's oldest enforcer, the man who'd seen more fights than God, went rigid. His weathered face drained of color. His hand moved toward his jacket. Not for a weapon. For his phone. Like he was about to make a call Antonio wouldn't want him to make. And in that moment, standing there with his fist cocked and his empire watching, Antonio Ricci realized something terrifying. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a mistake. The problem with trying to forget who you used to be is that your body never does. I felt it the moment Antonio's hand tightened on my wrist. The shift. The awakening. Like flipping a switch in a house you thought you'd abandoned. Pressure point. Radius nerve. 3 pounds of force, correct angle, he drops. The thought arrived unbidden. Clinical. Automatic. I tried to push it away. I'd promised myself I was done. That Lynn Moore, waitress, nobody, invisible, was real. That the woman who'd calculated kill zones the way other people calculated tips was buried so deep she'd never surface again. But Antonio Ricci wasn't asking for Lynn Moore. He was waking up the ghost. Target assessment. 6'2". 200 pounds. Right-handed. Leads with ego. The training came back in fragments. Voices I hadn't heard in 3 years. A fight isn't about strength. It's about geometry. Find the imbalance. Exploit it. Hesitation gets you killed. Precision keeps you alive. I'd spent 2 years in a facility that didn't exist on any map, learning how to end threats before they became problems. How to read body language like a second alphabet. How to make a man stop breathing without ever raising my voice. They'd called it asset development. I'd called it becoming a weapon. And weapons didn't retire. They just rusted. Antonio shoved me. Hard. His palm hit my shoulder. meant to send me stumbling backward into the crowd, meant to make me fall, meant to prove he owned the space I stood in. But I didn't stumble. The shove became an anchor point. My left hand snapped up, catching his wrist mid-extension. My fingers found the pressure point between tendon and bone. I twisted, not hard, just precise, and rotated inward, stepping inside his balance before his brain could register what was happening. Antonio's eyes went wide. His weight shifted forward, momentum betraying him. I drove my shoulder into his chest and used his own force against him, pivoting low and fast. His feet left the ground for half a heartbeat. Then I slammed him into the poker table. The sound was catastrophic. Cards exploded into the air like startled birds. Poker chips scattered across marble, clattering in every direction. The crystal tumbler shattered, whiskey spraying across green felt. Antonio hit the table hard, his back arching, breath leaving his lungs in a shocked gasp. The entire casino floor gasped with him. Silence detonated outward like a shockwave. Dealers froze. Gamblers stood. A woman at the roulette table dropped her champagne flute, and no one even looked when it shattered. Every eye in the room locked on us. On me. On the waitress standing over Antonio Ricci like gravity had just shifted in her favor. Antonio's face twisted. Shock melted into something uglier. Rage. He rolled off the table, fists clenched, face red. You! His bodyguards moved instantly. 3 men in black suits, earpieces barely visible, hands already reaching inside their jackets. They spread out, circling me like sharks who'd just smelled blood. But they hesitated. Because I wasn't running. Wasn't panicking. Wasn't doing anything that made sense for a terrified waitress who'd just assaulted a mafia boss. I was still. Centered. Weight balanced. Ready. One of the bodyguards, a younger guy with a scar through his eyebrow, spoke into his wrist mic. Boss is engaged. Moving to extract. But across the floor, Sal Dominic hadn't moved. The older enforcer stood frozen near the bar, his weathered face pale as ash. His eyes weren't on Antonio. They were on me. On the way I stood. The angle of my hips. The way my hands hung loose but deliberate at my sides. He'd seen this before. Not in a casino. Not in some public humiliation. In kill rooms. In black sites. In places where people like me were trained to end people like him. Sal's hand trembled as he pulled out his phone. His jaw worked, but no sound came. Then he found his voice. Quiet. Hoarse. Terrified. Boss. Antonio turned, fury still blazing in his eyes. What? Sal's throat bobbed. His eyes never left me. Boss, stop. Antonio didn't listen. Men like him never did. Sal's warning dissolved into the hum of the casino floor. Antonio heard it. I saw his eyes flick toward his enforcer for half a second, but rage was louder than reason. And rage made men predictable. You think you can embarrass me? Antonio snarled, voice raw. In my own house. He lunged. No technique. No strategy. Just fury wrapped in 200 pounds of muscle and entitlement. His right fist came high and wide, telegraphed by the rotation of his shoulder. Amateur. Emotional. Fatal. I sidestepped left, minimal movement, letting his momentum carry him past me. My hand snapped out, catching his extended arm at the elbow. I didn't pull. Didn't yank. I just guided. His own force did the rest. Antonio stumbled forward, off balance, and I was already moving. I drove my palm into his shoulder joint, precise, clinical, and his arm locked up. The pain would be sharp, immediate, the kind that made your fingers go numb. He gasped. I swept his leg. He went down. Antonio hit the marble on one knee, the impact echoing like a gunshot. His free hand slammed down to catch himself, rings scraping tile. He tried to rise. I didn't let him. My knee pressed into his spine, just enough pressure to pin him in place. I wrenched his arm up behind his back, controlled, stopping just before the joint would dislocate. "Don't move," I said quietly. Not loud. Not threatening. Just fact. Antonio froze. Not because I told him to. Because his body understood what his brain didn't. One more inch and his shoulder would separate. The casino floor had gone silent. Not the stunned silence from before. This was different. This was the kind of silence that came when prey realized it had been watching the wrong predator. A dealer near the blackjack table stepped backward, slowly, like sudden movement might draw attention. A woman in a red dress grabbed her partner's arm, eyes wide, mouth open. One of Antonio's bodyguards shifted forward, hand on his weapon. "Don't," Sal barked. The bodyguard stopped. Because Sal wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking at the empty space around me. At the angles. The positioning. At the fact that if someone fired, I'd have Antonio moved before the trigger cleared the guard. And everyone in the room knew it. "Let me go," Antonio hissed through clenched teeth. His voice shook. Not from pain. From humiliation. "You're making a mistake," I said, my tone unchanged. Calm. Almost bored. "I don't want to hurt you." "Then why?" "Because you didn't give me a choice." I felt his muscles tense, felt him calculating whether he could break free, felt the exact moment he realized he couldn't. Around us, the casino seemed to exhale. The kind of breath people take when they realize the violence might actually stop. Antonio's men stood in a loose semicircle, hands hovering near weapons, eyes darting between their boss and each other, waiting for orders. But Antonio wasn't giving orders anymore. He was trying not to scream. Security finally moved. Not toward me. Away. 3 guards in crisp uniforms backed toward the exits, radios crackling, voices low and urgent. One of them was already on the phone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I saw his face. Fear. The kind that spreads like infection. A pit boss near the roulette wheel muttered something to a colleague. They both looked at me. Then they moved their players to a different section, giving me space. Like I was a bomb no one wanted to defuse. I released Antonio's arm and stepped back. Not far. Just enough to let him stand. He rose slowly, cradling his shoulder, breath ragged. His suit was wrinkled. His hair disheveled. His rings had left scratches on the marble where he'd fallen. Antonio Ricci looked small. And he knew it. His crew saw it. The entire room saw it. He straightened, jaw clenched, eyes blazing with something darker than rage. Desperation. "Who are you?" he demanded, voice cracking at the edges. I didn't answer. The question hung in the air like smoke. Antonio took a step forward, fists shaking. "I asked you a question." Still I said nothing, because silence, I'd learned, was the loudest threat of all. I moved closer. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just close enough that only Antonio could hear what came next. His bodyguards tensed, but no one moved. They'd learned. The room had learned. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a whisper that barely crossed the space between us. Umbra non dormit. Latin. 4 words. The shadow does not sleep. Antonio's face went white. The phrase meant nothing to civilians. Nothing to cops or feds or even most criminals. But in the underworld, the real underworld, the one that operated in sealed files and unmarked graves, it meant everything. It was a code, a signature, a warning passed between people who dealt in death for governments that pretended they didn't exist. Asset identification protocol. The kind of thing you only heard right before someone disappeared forever. Antonio's breath caught in his chest. His pupils dilated, flooding with recognition he didn't want to have. "No," he whispered. I stepped back, giving him space to process, giving him time to remember. 3 years ago, Antonio had been consolidating territory in the East District. A rival syndicate, the Constantine family, had pushed back. Hard. They'd hired protection. The expensive kind. Within a week, 5 of Antonio's men were dead. Clean kills. No evidence. No witnesses. Just bodies that looked like accidents until you knew what to look for. Antonio had paid for information. Bought access to reports that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. That's when he'd first seen the file. Project designation. Nightshade. No photo. No real name. Just a list of confirmed eliminations that read like a horror novel written by accountants. 14 sanctioned targets. 23 collateral threats neutralized. 0 failures. And then 3 years ago the file went cold. No final report. No termination notice. Just a single word stamped across the last page in red ink. Dissolved. The asset had vanished. Some said retirement. Others said elimination. Most assumed death. Because people like that didn't just leave. Antonio stared at me now, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to believe. You're. He couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't confirm it. Didn't deny it. I just held his gaze. And that was answer enough. You were supposed to be dead, he breathed. I was supposed to be invisible, I corrected. You made that impossible. Antonio's hands shook. He clenched them into fists, trying to hide it, but the tremor spread to his shoulders. His empire was watching him unravel. And he knew it. Then something shifted in his eyes. Desperation gave birth to denial. He laughed. It started low, forced, but grew louder. More manic. You think I'm scared of a story? Antonio's voice rose, projecting now, playing to the crowd. Some code phrase. Some ghost story criminals tell each other. He spread his arms wide, spinning to address his men. She's a waitress. You're telling me you believe. I believe you're still breathing, I interrupted, voice flat. That should tell you everything. The laughter died in his throat. Antonio's jaw worked. His rings caught the light as his fists clenched and unclenched. He was trapped. Humiliated in front of his crew. His authority hemorrhaging with every second he didn't regain control. So he did what desperate men always do. He escalated. You know what? Antonio's voice turned cold. Hard. I don't care who you used to be. He straightened his jacket, rolled his shoulders, trying to rebuild the illusion of power. This is my house, my city, my rules. He turned to his bodyguards, the 3 men still frozen in their semicircle. And in my house, nobody puts their hands on me and walks away. His hand rose. Slow. Deliberate. Pointing at me like a judge delivering a sentence. The room held its breath. Sal moved forward, mouth opening to speak, but Antonio cut him off. Shoot her. The words dropped like stones. Silence detonated. I didn't move. Didn't flinch. The bodyguards looked at each other. Then at Antonio. Then at me. Their hands drifted toward their weapons. But not one of them drew. Because standing there, watching me watch them back, they understood something Antonio was too proud to accept. If they pulled those guns, Some of them wouldn't leave this room alive. And none of them wanted to find out which ones. Antonio's voice cracked. I said, shoot her. Still, no one moved. I moved before Antonio's men could process the order. 2 steps. That's all it took. I closed the distance between us and positioned myself directly behind Antonio, my hand settling on his shoulder. Not grabbing, not threatening, just there. A reminder. Antonio stiffened. His breath hitched. Because he understood geometry now. Understood angles. Understood that the 3 men pointing guns in our direction had a problem. Me. And him. In a straight line. Lower your weapons, I said. Not loud. Not frantic. The same tone I'd used to ask someone to pass the salt. The bodyguards didn't move. Their eyes flicked between Antonio and each other, fingers hovering near triggers, waiting for confirmation that this was really happening. That their boss, Antonio Ricci, the man who'd built an empire on making people obey, was now a shield. I said, lower them, I repeated. One of the guards, the younger one with a scar through his eyebrow, glanced at Sal. Sal's face was carved from stone. He gave the smallest shake of his head. Don't. The message was clear. Boss. Scar-Eyebrow's voice cracked. Orders. Antonio's jaw clenched. I felt the tension ripple through his shoulders. He wanted to say something. Wanted to roar commands and watch his men execute without question. But he couldn't. Because the math was simple. If they fired, the bullets would have to go through him to reach me. And I would make sure they did. If they fire, I said, voice calm as a death certificate, you die first. The words landed like a blade. Antonio's breathing quickened. Shallow. Rapid. For the first time in his life, Antonio Ricci understood what it felt like to be prey. Around us, the casino had become a museum. Frozen. Silent. Every eye locked on the tableau at the center of the floor. Dealers stood with cards in hand. Gamblers clutched chips. Security guards whispered into radios. But no one approached. Because approaching meant choosing a side. And no one knew which side would survive. The bodyguards held their positions, weapons drawn but not aimed. Not anymore. They'd lowered the barrels. Just a fraction. Just enough. Scar-Eyebrow's hand trembled. Boss, we can't. Shut up, Antonio hissed. But his voice had lost its edge. The command came out hollow. Desperate. He turned his head slightly, trying to see me in his peripheral vision. You won't kill me, he said. Not here. Not in front of everyone. You're right, I agreed. Antonio exhaled. Relief flooding his features. I won't kill you, I continued. But they don't know that. I tilted my head toward his men. Look at them, Antonio. Really look. He did. And what he saw broke him. His bodyguards, men he'd paid, trained, trusted, stood frozen. Not with loyalty. With fear. The younger one's hand shook so badly he'd engaged the safety on his weapon. Another had his finger off the trigger entirely, pointed at the ground. And Sal Dominic, who'd been with Antonio since the beginning, who'd buried bodies and burned bridges without blinking. Sal looked terrified. Not of me. Of what Antonio had unleashed. They're not afraid of dying, I said softly, close enough that only Antonio could hear. They're afraid of the choice. Saving you or saving themselves. They're loyal. They're employed, I corrected. And employment ends when the cost is too high. Antonio's shoulders sagged. Just slightly. Just enough. The room saw it. His empire saw it. The king was mortal. Silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. No one fired. No one moved. The only sound was the distant chime of a slot machine, absurdly cheerful, echoing from the far end of the casino. Antonio's hands opened and closed at his sides. His rings glinted under the chandeliers, but the light felt dimmer now, less golden, more like brass. He swallowed. Once, twice. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. A whisper meant only for me. "What's your name?" Not defiant. Not demanding. Pleading. Because Antonio Ricci, the man who'd spent his entire life making people fear him, needed to know who had just taken everything. I stepped back. Slowly. Deliberately. My hand lifted from Antonio's shoulder, and the absence felt louder than touch. He stood frozen for a moment, like a man who'd just discovered gravity worked differently than he remembered. Then he turned. His eyes found mine, searching for something. Mercy, maybe. Or understanding. He wouldn't find either. "Lynn Moore," I said. My voice carried across the silent casino floor. Not loud, but in the stillness, it might as well have been a gunshot. "That's the name I use now." Antonio's brow furrowed. Confusion flickered across his face. Now, the word hung between us, loaded with implications he was still too stunned to unpack. "The woman you tried to break tonight?" I continued, my tone unchanged. Clinical. Final. "She doesn't exist anymore." I took another step back, putting distance between us, between who I was and who I'd been forced to become. "She never did." Antonio's mouth opened, closed. No sound came out. His legs gave out. Not dramatically. Not violently. He just collapsed. His body folded backward, catching the edge of a leather chair. He dropped into it like a puppet with cut strings, arms hanging at his sides, chest heaving. Around us, the room exhaled. But no one moved. His men stood in their semicircle, weapons lowered now, faces carved from shock and uncertainty. Dealers clutched cards they'd forgotten they were holding. Gamblers stared, drinks paused halfway to lips, chips abandoned on felt. The entire Belmont Casino, Antonio Ricci's kingdom, his monument to power, watched their king crumble. And he knew it. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles white. His jaw worked, trying to form words that wouldn't come. Sal moved forward, just one step, hand extended like he might help his boss stand. Antonio waved him off. Violently. "Don't," he rasped. Sal stopped. His hand dropped. Even now, even broken, Antonio's pride wouldn't let him be helped. It was pathetic. And everyone saw it. I moved closer again. Not threatening. Just near enough that he'd have to look up to meet my eyes. He did. And what I saw there wasn't rage anymore. It was comprehension. 3 years ago, I said quietly, I walked away. From the blood. From the orders. From rooms where people like you decided who lived and who disappeared. Antonio's breathing slowed. Listening now. Finally. I chose peace, I continued. Chose to be invisible. To serve drinks and collect tips and pretend I was normal. I crouched down, I level with him now. I chose silence. The words landed soft. But they cut deep. You mistook that silence for weakness, I said. You thought because I didn't speak I couldn't. Because I didn't fight I wouldn't. Antonio's throat bobbed. You were wrong. I stood, straightening my vest. The fabric was still damp with whiskey. Still smelled like his humiliation and my restraint. Men like you, I said, voice carrying now, addressing not just Antonio but the entire room, always make the same mistake. You think fear equals strength. That dominance equals respect. That silence means surrender. I looked around the casino. at his men, his empire, his legacy, all of it watching, waiting. But silence isn't weakness, I said. Sometimes it's just exhaustion. My eyes returned to Antonio. Exhaustion from killing. The words dropped like stones into still water. Ripples spread. Someone near the bar inhaled sharply. A dealer took a step back. One of the bodyguard's hands drifted away from his weapon entirely. Palm open, fingers spread. A gesture of surrender. Antonio sat in his chair, expensive suit wrinkled, rings glinting uselessly, face pale under the chandeliers. He looked small, and old, and afraid. "Please," he whispered. Just that. One word. Not "please don't kill me." Not "please let me go." Just "please." Like the word itself was a white flag. The room held its breath. Dealers froze. Guards stopped shifting. Even the distant hum of slot machines seemed to fade. Everyone waited. Waited to see if the woman who used to kill for a living would remember how. Waited to see if mercy was still an option. Waited to see if Antonio Ricci would leave this room alive. I looked down at him. At the man who'd poured whiskey on my shirt and demanded I fight. At the man who'd grabbed my wrist and thought he owned me. At the man who'd just learned that some ghosts never die. They just learn to haunt in silence. It would be easy. That's what I thought, looking down at Antonio Ricci slumped in his chair, face drained of color, empire crumbling around him. So easy. I knew 17 ways to end a life without leaving evidence. 12 more if I didn't care about being quiet. Pressure points that stopped hearts. Strikes that collapsed windpipes. Angles that turned necks into broken things that didn't support heads anymore. The knowledge sat in my mind like a loaded gun I'd never fully unholstered. I could feel my fingers twitching. Muscle memory whispering possibilities. One move. That's all it would take. Flashback. 4 years ago. A hotel room in Prague. Rain against windows. A man in an expensive suit, hands bound, begging in a language I didn't speak. My handler's voice in my earpiece. Clean. Quiet. Confirmed. I'd done what I was trained to do. Later, I'd learned he had a daughter. 8 years old. Piano lessons on Thursdays. The file said he was a threat. The photos on his phone said he was a father. Both were true. Only one mattered to the people who sent me. Flashback. 3 years ago. My last assignment. A warehouse in Baltimore. 3 targets. All confirmed. I'd completed the mission. Then I'd walked to the bathroom and vomited until my ribs ached. Stared at my hands under fluorescent lights and couldn't recognize them anymore. That night, I'd burned my credentials. Changed my name. Disappeared. Chose to be no one. Because being someone had cost too much. Antonio's voice pulled me back. "I'm sorry." The words came out broken. Small. I looked at him. Really looked. He wasn't a monster. Not really. Just a man who'd mistaken cruelty for strength so many times he'd forgotten the difference. A man who'd built an empire on fear and discovered too late that fear was a foundation made of sand. He could die tonight. Or he could live. And living with this humiliation, this knowledge, this permanent scar on his reputation, would hurt worse than any death I could give him. I straightened. Slowly, deliberately, I smoothed down my vest. Adjusted my collar. The fabric was still damp with whiskey, still reeked of Antonio's arrogance. But I wore it anyway. I walked back to where I'd set down my tray. It lay on a side table, silver gleaming under the chandeliers, glasses still perfectly arranged despite everything that had happened. I picked it up. The weight settled in my hands. Familiar. Safe. A waitress's tool. not a weapons. I turned back to Antonio one last time. He sat in his chair, looking up at me with eyes that would carry this moment forever. You want to know the difference between us? I asked. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. I walked away from violence, I said. You walked toward it. Celebrated it. Built your entire life around it. I shifted the tray, balancing it on one hand. And tonight, when you had the chance to show strength, you showed exactly what you are. I leaned in, close enough that only he could hear the final words. Men like you always lose. Not because you're weak, but because you mistake cruelty for power. I stepped back. And power. I looked around the room. At his men. His empire. His kingdom built on broken bones and buried threats. Power is choosing not to break you when I could. Antonio's face crumpled. Not with pain. With understanding. Because mercy from someone who could kill you wasn't kindness. It was the cruelest dominance of all. I walked. Through the scattered poker chips. Past the shattered glass. Between Antonio's frozen bodyguards. The crowd parted like water. No one spoke. No one moved. No one tried to stop me. Dealers watched me pass with wide eyes. Gamblers clutched their drinks. Security guards stood at attention, radio silent. I walked through Antonio Ricci's empire like a ghost passing through walls. Untouchable. Free. The exit doors stood ahead, glass reflecting the chandelier light, reflecting me. A woman in a stained uniform carrying an empty tray. Just a waitress. Nothing more. I pushed through the doors and into the night air. Behind me, the casino remained frozen. And in his leather chair, surrounded by everything he'd built and everyone he'd commanded, Antonio Ricci sat alone, watching the woman who'd spared his life walk away, knowing he'd never forget her name, knowing he'd never stop wondering what would have happened if she'd chosen differently, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd just been shown mercy by someone who didn't owe him anything. And that mercy had destroyed him more completely than violence ever could. The story spread before sunrise. By the time morning light touched the city, every criminal worth knowing had heard some version of what happened at the Belmont Casino. The details varied. Some said the waitress had been a federal agent. Others claimed she was a rival syndicate's enforcer sent to humiliate Antonio Ricci publicly. A few, the ones who'd actually been there, said nothing at all. Because they'd seen her eyes. And silence was safer. Antonio Ricci never challenged anyone publicly again. Not at his casino. Not at his clubs. Not in the street. The man who'd built an empire on spectacle and dominance became a ghost in his own kingdom. He still attended meetings. Still collected payments. Still wore expensive suits and heavy rings. But something fundamental had broken. His men noticed it first. The way he'd pause before giving orders, like he was asking permission instead of demanding obedience. The way his hands would shake when someone raised their voice. The way he'd flinch, just slightly, when doors opened too quickly behind him. Sal Dominic retired 3 weeks later. Told Antonio he was getting too old for the life. That his knees hurt. That he wanted to see his grandchildren grow up. But everyone knew the truth. Sal had recognized the technique. Had seen what Lynn Moore was capable of. And he wanted no part of what came next if she ever decided mercy was overrated. The other bodyguards whispered. In break rooms. In cars during long surveillance shifts. In bars after hours when the whiskey made them brave enough to say what they'd been thinking. Don't fuck with quiet people, one said. Some women aren't scared. They're just patient, said another. The boss thought he owned the room. Turns out he was the only one who didn't know who was really dangerous. The warnings spread. Through crews. Through families. Through the underground networks that ran the city's real business. A new rule emerged, unspoken but understood. Never assume silence is weakness. The Belmont Casino became infamous. Not for the gambling. Not for the luxury. For the night a waitress dismantled a mafia boss in front of his empire and walked away without a scratch. Tourists started asking about it. Dealers told the story to high rollers. Security guards gave conflicting accounts to anyone who'd listen. The management tried to bury it. Scrubbed the footage. Paid off witnesses. Threatened employees with termination if they spoke to the press. It didn't matter. Legends didn't need evidence. They needed believers. And everyone who'd been there that night believed. Lynn Moore disappeared the next day. Her apartment was empty by noon. Furniture gone. Lease terminated. No forwarding address. The casino manager called her phone 17 times. It went straight to voicemail. He filed a missing person report. The police took statements. Checked cameras. Found nothing. It was like she'd never existed. Except for one thing. In the staff locker room, taped to the inside of her locker door, someone found a note. 3 words in neat handwriting. I kept walking. No signature. No explanation. Just a reminder that some people left violence behind not because they couldn't handle it, but because they'd handled too much. Months passed. Antonio's empire didn't collapse. But it changed. He became cautious. Calculating. The kind of leader who asked questions before throwing punches. His men said he'd gotten soft. His accountant said he'd gotten smart. Antonio said nothing. But late at night, alone in his penthouse, he'd pour a glass of whiskey and stare out at the city lights. And he'd wonder where she'd gone, who she'd been, whether mercy had been a gift or a curse, whether she was out there somewhere, serving drinks in another city, waiting for another arrogant fool to make the same mistake he had, or whether she'd finally found the peace she'd been looking for. He never found out. No one did. Because Lynn Moore, or whatever name she used now, had earned something most people never got. Silence. Not the silence of fear. Not the silence of weakness. The silence of someone who'd fought enough battles to know when to stop fighting. The silence of restraint that could only come from power held back, not power lacking. The legend lived on. In whispered warnings. In cautionary tales. In moments when someone thought about humiliating a stranger and remembered the waitress who destroyed a king with nothing but precision and mercy. And somewhere, in some city far from the Belmont Casino, a quiet woman served drinks and collected tips and smiled politely when customers got loud. Because some people aren't quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because they're done killing. And they've earned the right to rest. Thanks for watching till the very end. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be dropping another unforgettable story tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss it.